"If you throw that line in the water again, I'm calling the cops," the guard snapped, yanking the fishing rod straight from the hands of the elderly man. No one stepped in. No one said a word. His old navy cap was the only thing that fell, landing softly on the dock as he turned to leave, carrying the snapped rod like a folded flag held at a soldier's farewell. But come morning, something strange stirred the lake. Through the mist, boats began gliding in, quiet, sleek, painted in military gray. Who sent them? And why, after all this time, did it seem like the lake had remembered the man it once embraced? Welcome to Uncovered Tales. Today, we're digging into what really happened. Frank Donovan was 74. A Navy veteran whose sun-worn face had witnessed more sunrises on this lake than anyone still living in town. He was born here, raised along these shores, and after serving his country at sea, he came back, drawn to this place where land and water met in a silent, steady rhythm. For 4 decades, he cast his nets into these familiar waters every morning. His lone figure, outlined by dawn's first light, had become part of the lake's daily ritual. But Frank didn't fish for sport or profit. His catches went straight to the church's soup kitchen, the local shelter, or to elderly neighbors who could no longer make the trip themselves. His life followed a tide of its own: rise before sunrise, row the old wooden boat to the lake center, then return with enough fish to feed the ones who needed it most. Meanwhile, the town of Millwater was changing. The industries that once fed its people, fishing, logging, faded, replaced by tourism and trendy storefronts. Where bait shops and lumberyards used to be, there were now espresso bars and boutiques. Yet Frank remained, unchanged and steady, his weathered USS Liberty cap a quiet badge of the life he'd lived. The trouble began when the town council, trying to fill budget gaps, struck a deal behind closed doors. They sold the public lake and its surrounding parkland to Horizon Leisure Group, a flashy development company with big promises of turning the area into a luxury destination. The deal was pushed through fast, with hardly any say from the public and plenty of political backroom talk. On the Tuesday morning everything shifted. Frank arrived at his regular spot just as the sky began glowing with a soft orange hue. He pulled his tackle box from his old, rusted pickup, adjusted the cap on his head, and walked down the same dock that had carried his weight for more years than he could count. The air was brisk with the first chill of fall, and mist curled off the lake like old friends rising to greet him. He'd just opened up his folding chair when a voice sliced through the morning calm. "Sir, this is private property now. You need to leave." Frank looked up to see a young man in a brand new security uniform approaching. The Horizon Leisure logo was stitched prominently across the chest. "I've been fishing here since before your folks were even born," Frank said, his tone calm, his hand steady as he readied his line. "That doesn't matter anymore," the guard replied, voice turning cold. "The lake's under new management. You can't fish here without a permit from Horizon." Without saying a word, Frank reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a weathered card, a special exemption granted to him years earlier by the town's former mayor, recognizing his decades of service to the community. "I've got permission," he said, holding it out. The guard barely looked at it before snatching it away. Slowly, and with a smug kind of finality, he tore it clean down the middle. "This doesn't mean anything now, old man. There are new owners, and new rules." Someone nearby had already begun filming the scene on their phone. Frank could hear soft laughter coming from the edge of the crowd as the guard grabbed his arm and began dragging him back from the water. "Wait," Frank said, reaching toward his rod, still leaning against the railing. But as he moved, the guard shoved him. Frank stumbled, and the rod clattered to the dock, splitting with a sharp crack that rang out across the lake. "Consider that your final warning," the guard said loud enough for the growing onlookers. "Next time, you're getting charged with trespassing." In the video that would soon go viral, Frank could be seen kneeling down, quietly gathering the splintered pieces of his fishing rod, the same rod his late wife had given him for their last anniversary, just before cancer took her. He handled the fragments as if he were folding a flag, slow and deliberate, filled with meaning. From the small crowd of morning joggers and passers-by, not one voice rose in protest. Some filmed. Some murmured. Most just stood there, uneasy, but unwilling to interfere with what looked like progress marching forward. One young man in sleek running gear leaned toward his friend and said, loudly enough to be heard, "Finally cleaning this place up. That old guy's been squatting on prime lakefront for years." Frank heard it. He didn't flinch. He didn't respond. With a quiet kind of grace, the kind you don't see much anymore, he tucked the broken rod under his arm and walked back to his truck. Behind him, the guard was already hammering in signs along the dock, "No fishing, private property." As Frank pulled away, the sun finally cleared the horizon, casting golden light across the water. In his rearview mirror, he saw the construction trucks pulling in, the early wave of a new era that had no place for men like him. No one paid attention to the old man's hands as he folded the torn permit with practiced precision, creasing it just like he'd once folded orders at sea. No one noticed the way his eyes lingered on the water, scanning the horizon with the quiet alertness of a man who had once stood watch for enemies beyond the waves. His cabin, tucked at the edge of the forest, was a place he'd built with his own two hands after returning from war. Unlike the million-dollar lakefront homes now springing up, his house was built for living, not showing off. The wood-paneled walls were filled with history, framed photos of Navy ships, faded commendations, and a shadow box filled with medals he never talked about. He laid the broken rod on the table, then slowly opened the cedar chest where he kept the things that mattered most. From inside, he lifted a neatly folded American flag, the same one that had covered Eleanor's coffin 8 years earlier. Next to it sat his Navy insignia and an old photograph of his crew, standing together on the deck of the USS Liberty. Frank had been one of the few who made it back after a vicious storm slammed their vessel off the Philippine coast in 1972. He had secured the lines that kept 3 of his crewmates from being swept overboard. That day taught him a lesson he never forgot: when the world starts falling apart, the only thing that matters is what you hold on to. Frank eased into his armchair with a slow, weary motion, the weight of his years pressing down on him more than usual. Through the window, the lake sparkled in the distance, familiar yet now completely out of reach, like it belonged to some far-off country. "Day 14 since I was barred from the lake," he wrote in the leather-bound journal he'd carried with him since his Navy days. "I've never felt more like a stranger in the place I've spent my whole life." Lately, calls from Phoenix had become more frequent, his daughter gently trying to steer him toward something new. "It's time, Dad," she kept telling him. "This town isn't yours anymore." Each time, Frank had kindly but firmly declined. How could he put into words that his connection to this place went far deeper than any legal document or property map? That the rhythm of the lake's waves had somehow always been in sync with the beat of his heart? That evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops, Frank checked his ancient flip phone, and what he saw made his heart sink. The video of his confrontation had gone viral. It had been shared thousands of times online, edited with mocking sound effects and cruel captions like, "Boomer can't read, no trespassing" signs, and "Old fish fights the future, and loses." The comments below were even worse. "That generation thinks they own everything just because they were here first. Maybe if he'd invested in property instead of trout, he wouldn't be whining now. Pack it up, Grandpa. The world belongs to the people who can afford it." A knock at the door pulled him from the glowing screen. It was Jack Edwards, the hardware store owner, one of the few old-timers still left in Millwater. Caught wind of what happened down at the lake, Jack said as he stepped inside, accepting a steaming mug of coffee. "Hell of a thing." "They own it now," Frank replied evenly, his voice steady and free of bitterness. "They've got every right to decide what happens there." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "This town's changing, Frank. Maybe it's time to move on." Frank finished for him. "I can't. This is home, Jack. I laid Eleanor to rest here. Every memory I've got is in this soil." "I get it," Jack said quietly. "But these developers. They've practically bought out the council. Word is they're planning to turn the whole shoreline into a members-only resort. The annual fees alone are more than most folks here make in a month. And what does the town say about that? Jack looked away for a moment before answering. Most of the original families already sold out and left. The new folks, they want higher property values. They're calling it progress. When Jack left, Frank stepped out onto his porch, eyes fixed on the lake that had given life to generations before him. In the growing darkness, he could see harsh white lights now installed along the shoreline, unwelcoming and artificial against the gentle quiet of nature. He remembered warm summer mornings teaching kids to bait hooks and handle fish with care. He remembered frying up fresh catches for town cookouts. The elderly women who relied on his weekly deliveries. The mayors who once shook his hand in gratitude. All of it wiped away with a signature and a development deal. To them, the lake wasn't alive, it was just a blank space on a blueprint with dollar signs in the margins. His phone rang again, his daughter, calling from Arizona. "I saw the video, Dad," she said, her voice tight with worry. "This is exactly why I keep asking you to come out here. You don't deserve that." "It's just a bad moment," he said softly, trying not to let the weight of it reach her. "Nothing more." "No, it's not. And you know it. That place doesn't see you anymore. They've forgotten who held it together when things got hard." Maybe she had a point. As full night settled over the town, Frank sat alone and thought about the long line of Donovans who had cast their lines into this same lake. His father had taught him how to fish here. His grandfather had helped open the town's very first fish market. Their blood ran through these waters. "I'll think about it," he told her, though deep down, they both knew the truth. Some men, like the oldest trees in the forest, can only keep living if they stay rooted in the soil where they first stood tall. He wasn't asking for much. Not for compensation or recognition. He only wanted to keep doing what he'd done all his life, cast a line into the lake that knew him as well as he knew it. If you've ever felt like you were being pushed out of the place you once called home, type still. The next morning arrived with the kind of sharp, flawless clarity that autumn sometimes delivers, crisp air, clean light, the world washed in gold. Frank woke before sunrise, just as he always had, and sat quietly on his porch, cradling a cup of black coffee. Without his morning routine on the water, the early hours felt hollow, wide, slow, and unfamiliar. Then, right at 0700, a sound rolled across the lake. Not the gentle hum of fishing boats or the buzz of jet skis. No, this was different. It was the deep, commanding rumble of marine engines, machines with a purpose. Frank set down his mug and stood, instinctively drawn toward the sound. He walked to the edge of his property, curiosity outweighing the hesitation in his chest. What he saw froze him in place. 8 rigid-hull inflatable boats, each flying an American flag at the stern, cruised in tight, coordinated formation toward the dock. On board were Navy personnel, not in their everyday fatigues, but in full-service dress blues, as if reporting for a memorial or a ceremony. Word traveled fast in Millwater. Doors swung open. People spilled out of shops. Construction workers dropped their tools. Everyone turned to look as the flotilla made its silent, powerful approach. Even the guard who had shoved Frank days earlier stood frozen at the dock entrance, radio pressed to his mouth, but clearly receiving no orders, no protocol for what to do when the Navy shows up on your brand new, private property. The lead boat glided in with practiced precision, coming to rest at the dock like it had done it 100 times before. A tall man stepped ashore, silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, the insignia of a retired Navy colonel stitched proudly into his uniform. Richard Hale walked with the unmistakable bearing of a man who had once given orders on a battlefield. His eyes scanned the crowd, cutting through the sea of faces until they landed on Frank, standing quietly at the edge. "Attention!" Colonel Hale barked, his voice crisp and commanding. In an instant, every sailor straightened, boots together, shoulders squared. He took a step forward, turning to face the townspeople gathered on the shoreline, and spoke with a steady, resonant tone that carried across the water. "My name is Colonel Richard Hale, United States Navy, retired. 42 years ago, during the violent storm that crippled the USS Liberty, Chief Petty Officer Frank Donovan pulled 12 of my men to safety, risking his life to carry the wounded through crashing waves and chaos." A ripple of astonishment moved through the crowd. People who had walked past Frank for years without a second thought were now seeing him in a different light, struggling to reconcile the quiet fisherman with the war hero standing in their midst. "But what most of you don't know," Hale continued, "is that Frank didn't stop serving after the Navy. When the flood of '89 hit, he ferried 27 residents to safety in a boat barely meant for 5. During the drought of '95, he installed water purification systems for families with poisoned wells. And for over 40 years, he's been tracking the lake's health, data the EPA has used in its regional reports." Then another figure stepped off a different boat. A younger man in uniform, his voice calm but full of emotion. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Michael Reed. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for this man. During the evacuation of Saigon, Frank Donovan carried my father on his back through enemy fire. Years later, when my dad couldn't afford to send me to college, Mr. Donovan, quietly, anonymously, set up a scholarship for veterans' children. I'm standing here today because someone who never asked for recognition gave everything for others." Gasps and whispers swirled through the crowd, but they were quickly interrupted by a sharp voice pushing forward. "This is private property," began the Horizon Leisure Group manager, clipboard in hand. "Actually," said a woman as she stepped from the third boat, holding out an official-looking packet of documents, "I'm Laura Stevens with the Department of the Interior. This lake is protected under the National Historical Waterways Protection Act. The sale was pushed through without the proper historical review, and as of this morning, all development is officially on hold pending a full investigation." Meanwhile, the security guard, the same one who had torn Frank's permit, stood awkwardly at the dock as a sailor approached him with a folded paper in hand. "This is a certified copy of Frank Donovan's 1983 agreement with the town," the sailor explained. "It grants him lifetime fishing rights, recognized federally under his environmental monitoring contract. That agreement remains valid regardless of changes in ownership." Phones were still recording, but the tone had shifted. What was once a spectacle for ridicule had become a moment of solemn respect. Across social media, #FrankDonovanDay was already beginning to trend. On shore, the veterans moved into formation, forming a quiet corridor that stretched from the dock entrance all the way to Frank's old fishing spot. With deliberate steps, Colonel Hale walked toward Frank and extended his hand. "You didn't have to come all this way," Frank said, voice low and thick with emotion. "Yes, we did," Hale replied softly. "You don't just erase a man's legacy, not ours, and not this town's." Frank nodded, saying nothing, as he accepted a newly laminated version of his permit. But the true shift wasn't in the paperwork, it was in the way the townspeople looked at him now. Not as some relic from a fading past, but as someone essential, permanent, and deeply respected. As the formalities wrapped up, Frank did something that caught everyone off guard. He walked back to his truck, reached behind the seat, and pulled out a second fishing rod, older, worn, but still in working condition. He returned to the dock, sat down at his usual spot, and, with the ease of a man who had done it more times than anyone could count, cast his line into the still waters. One by one, the veterans joined him, settling into place along the dock in a quiet show of solidarity. No speeches. No declarations. Just the sound of line hitting water and the peaceful silence of people who understood that sometimes, the strongest kind of protest is simply staying put. The days that followed what Millwater now called Navy Day, brought a wave of unexpected change. The story had exploded across national news outlets, hailed as a modern-day David versus Goliath tale. Facing mounting pressure, Horizon Leisure Group announced they would revisit their development plans to better respect the cultural and historical significance of the lake and its surrounding lands. A small ceremony was organized a week later to officially rename the eastern dock, Frank's Landing, Keeper of the Waters. The sign was handmade by a local carpenter, simple and unassuming, just like the man it honored. Frank showed up quietly, reluctant as ever to stand in the spotlight, but understanding that the moment wasn't about him alone. It was about what the town was choosing to remember, and preserve. What truly filled his heart, though, weren't the ceremonies or headlines. It was the kids. They began showing up in the mornings, first out of curiosity, drawn by the viral video, but soon because they wanted to learn. Frank taught them just like he once taught young sailors, how to tie a proper knot, how to watch the water for subtle movements, how to sit still until the right moment arrived. One morning, as a young girl struggled to bait her hook, she looked up at him and asked, "Do you ever get scared of the water?" Frank smiled, gently helping her secure the worm. "I was terrified when I was under it, back during the storm that nearly sank my ship," he said. "But I've never been afraid sitting beside it, watching over it." "Because you're friends?" she asked, her voice small but curious. "Because we understand each other," Frank replied. "Water remembers every single thing it touches. It's been here longer than we've been alive. It'll be here long after. The secret is learning how to listen to what it's trying to say." She nodded thoughtfully, like he had just confirmed something she already felt but didn't have words for. The security guard who had torn Frank's permit never showed up again. But one quiet morning, Frank arrived to find a brand new USS Liberty cap sitting on his bench. No note. No explanation. Just the hat, crisp, dark navy, the gold stitching catching the morning light. The golden embroidery on the new cap caught the morning light, but Frank didn't put it on. Instead, he rested his hand on it for a quiet moment, acknowledging the gesture without needing to say a word. Then, as he always had, he pulled on his old, sun-faded cap and began setting up his fishing gear. Some apologies are best left unspoken, and certain lessons hit hardest when shown, not said. Sensing the tide turning in town sentiment, Mayor Daniels created a Veterans Advisory Council to help guide future development decisions. Frank agreed to join, though not without hesitation. The council's first motion passed unanimously. A portion of the town's booming tourism revenue would go toward preserving public access to the natural spaces that had nurtured Millwater long before it became a luxury destination. Colonel Hale became a regular visitor. Once a month, he'd return, sometimes with fellow veterans, sometimes alone, to join Frank by the lake at dawn, when the world was still and the water mirrored the sky. Their conversations were sparse but rich in meaning, often about the seasons, the lake's subtle shifts, and how some things stayed steady even as everything else seemed to be speeding up. "They're still moving forward with that Western Shore project," Hale mentioned one quiet morning. "Condos. Marina. The usual." Frank nodded as he adjusted his reel. "Change is always coming. What matters is making sure not everything changes." The colonel smiled. "You, for example. Still holding your ground after all these years." Frank gave a small chuckle. "It's not me. It's the water. I'm just passing through like everyone else. But what we choose to do while we're here, that's what sticks." The lake, for its part, seemed untouched by all the noise. It continued on as it always had, mirroring clouds, dancing with the breeze, and offering fish to those patient enough to wait. Whatever battles played out along its edges were temporary. The lake itself remained unchanged, unmoved, and quietly eternal. That spring, nearly 6 months after what folks had started calling Navy Day, Frank arrived at his usual spot and found a group of elementary school students waiting with notebooks and clipboards. Their teacher explained that they were studying the lake's ecosystem as part of a year-long science project and hoped Frank might share what he knew. What followed was nothing short of a masterclass. Frank showed them how to test water clarity, how to spot signs of pollution, how to identify fish by their fins and scales. The kids were transfixed, scribbling notes as if they'd stumbled upon a living encyclopedia. "Mr. Donovan's been keeping lake records longer than the EPA," the teacher explained proudly. "His notebooks hold climate data that scientists now use to track environmental changes in our region." One boy raised his hand. "But, you're not a scientist," he said with the blunt honesty only a child can offer. "No," Frank replied with a smile. "I'm just someone who's been paying attention for a very long time." And maybe that was the heart of his legacy, not the medals tucked away in a cedar chest or the dock that now bore his name, but the quiet authority of a man who had never stopped watching, listening, and learning. In a world obsessed with big data and cutting-edge models, Frank represented something simpler but no less important: the power of bearing witness. The quiet strength of someone who had stayed long enough to notice the slow shifts others missed. The development on the western shore eventually went forward, though scaled down from the original blueprints. From Frank's dock, he could see modern glass-front buildings beginning to rise, their reflections shimmering across the lake's surface. But he didn't feel bitter. He understood why people came. The lake offered peace, the kind of calm you can't fake. Maybe, with time, the newcomers would come to understand what he had known for decades, that the worth of a place isn't measured by what you extract from it, but by how deeply you let yourself belong to it. Some folks live their entire lives quietly rooted in one spot, holding tight to what others let go. And sometimes, it's only when they're forced out that we finally see, some people can't be replaced. You might move on from this story in a few days. But if no one tells it again, it'll fade away like so many others. Subscribe to Uncovered Tales, where memory, kindness, and justice are kept alive, until the very end.